Hey, adapters, welcome back. In this episode, we explore the Toronto Green Standards, or TGS, and how geothermal energy helps us get closer to net zero. We touch upon Subterra's business model and how it enables developers to reach their sustainability goals without the financial barrier. We also discuss the best ways for developers to integrate geothermal into their designs. Joining me in this discussion is Kara Sloat, a senior mechanical engineer at Hammerschlag and Joff. Kara is an active promoter and designer of sustainable buildings with design experience in retrofits and new construction. Also joining me is David McMillan, a program manager with the City of Toronto's Environment and Energy Division. David is a community energy planning practitioner, well versed in land use planning, climate change, and municipal policymaking. And finally, Matthew Tokarek, president of Subterra Renewables. Matt is a professional engineer with expertise in building energy performance. Matthew also sits on the Canada's GBC Zero Carbon Building Standard Committee. Hi, Kara, Dave, and Matt. Welcome to the show.
Hey.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having us.
All right, guys, we're going to talk geothermal energy. Very excited about this, and we are going to just hop right in this conversation, but maybe some little bit of context setting of why we're even here. So, Matt, what is net zero emissions, and why is it important for the climate crisis we are in?
Sure. Yeah. So just to set the stage here with what we're talking about, you've probably heard of the climate crisis or global warming or however you want to describe it. And what we're really talking about is the fact that the global climate science community has agreed that based on human activity relating to industrialization and GHG emissions, the global temperature on average has increased by a few noticeable degrees Celsius, which may not seem all that bad, but in reality, the truth is that this is causing some strange things to happen on the Earth. The frequency and strength of extreme weather events like hurricanes, floods, droughts, fires, etc., are becoming more and more prevalent. And so this is going to have a very significant impact on people, on our economy, on politics, and other social matters. So that's really what we're trying to avoid here. And again, the problem comes down to the carbon emissions or the greenhouse gas emissions that we'll talk about here today. As we sort of zoom in, Canada has set a target for reaching net zero carbon by the year 2050, which means that we need to reduce in many arenas, many sectors like industrial, buildings, transportation, et cetera. If we look at a city like Toronto or other dense urban areas, much of the city's greenhouse gas emissions are actually related to buildings. And if you look at the inventory report from 2019, approximately 60% were due to buildings, which is largely attributed to space heating from natural gas combustion. So in response to all of that, we're talking today about net zero design and net zero buildings, which is really the design process or the achievement of having a building that either generates or procures as much carbon offset through renewable energy or purchases as it uses on-site operationally.
Okay, so Kara, Matt just sort of set the stage there, but do you have anything to add? Do you want to add some context to that?
I think Matt's done a great job of covering it. The big thing that shifted in net zero buildings is establishing some really clear guidelines about how good is good enough to be net zero. So you can procure essentially an infinite amount of renewable energy if you're only thinking about a single building. But when we're trying to address the entire Canadian portfolio of buildings, there's a threshold of energy efficiency we have to hit so that if it's not possible to put enough renewables on the site a building is located, and in reality, we know that buildings above 1 or 2 stories don't have enough room for solar panels to power them, then we have to be very energy efficient to be able to have enough renewable energy to go around.
Okay, great. So David, I'm going to bring you in here. Let's talk about the history and the background of those Toronto Green Standards. Can you kind of tell us how they came about?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Toronto Green Standard, the TGS, is really where the rubber hits the road. It's something that started in 2006 in a voluntary sense, voluntary for the industry, mandatory for city buildings, and eventually it became mandatory for everybody in 2010. And essentially, it requires developers to achieve. There are minimum standards and there are voluntary higher performance standards. So back in
when it was first created in that 2006 to 2010 phase, there was 2 tiers, sort of tier 1 being a minimum, tier 2 being higher voluntary performance with incentives. Since then, it's evolved quite a bit. We now have 4 tiers, and when it comes in, in May 1st, when we move to version 4, there will only be 3. And essentially, what we're doing is we're raising the floor every 4 years. So those 3 tiers, what it actually means, it's actually harder to achieve the minimum performance. And so basically, the closer we get to 2030, which is the date for sort of net zero buildings in Toronto, new buildings, essentially the minimum requirements become net zero. So we're pushing the industry every 4 years to essentially step up their performance in line with our climate goals. And the TGS is the mechanism through which we do that. And I'll just shout out to my colleagues in city planning. We leverage the planning approvals process to implement it, and then my team in environment and energy, we work with the developers to help them get there. So it's a joint effort all around.
Okay, so Matt, how do these green standards align building performance with the national net zero targets?
Like Dave said, it's really about making the rubber hit the road, and in a sense, the city sort of holds the keys to the developer's ability to get projects across the line, in that they need to meet these Toronto Green standards and they need to meet these efficiency standards in order to get their effectively their building permits and their site plan applications approved. So the reality is that this is sort of the way that it's being policed and implemented, because of the available measures, including incentives and taxes and mandates. The mandates are often highly effective, and that's sort of what we need to do to bring the industry up to speed.
All right, David, I'm going to go back to you really quickly here. So these green standards, it's helping you get to net zero. Can you kind of maybe get it in the weeds on how you're doing that? So you're establishing these standards, but I guess there's a lot of partnerships. What are some of the ways that you're actually getting there to net zero?
Right. So in the move to version 4, really, when as the performance level jumps up, the pathways, there's fewer pathways in which to get to net zero, and consultants and their clients need to pay attention in a few key areas. So probably the most complicated one, or the most difficult one, is paying attention to the architecture. The form of the building and some of the early design decisions really have an impact on how much energy you use, and then essentially how much energy you need to supply in order to provide heating and cooling and power to that building. And so architecture is one of the earliest considerations for any project. It's really key to actually overall energy and emissions performance when the time comes to actually submit for Toronto Green Standard compliance. So that's a big one, and that's something we encourage architects to get involved with early. The other piece, really, that's what we're going to talk about, I think, later, is the notion that fuel switching is really important to reduce emissions. I mean, really, that's where the carbon is in Toronto, as Matt said. It's really coming from natural gas for space and water heating. And so the goal, to put it simply, in Toronto for new buildings is to avoid that natural gas use. And so what we encourage and emphasize is, in Ontario, at least with our clean grid, is electrification. That's really the decarbonization plan. And there are different technologies to do that. But I think the key is to think about, between client, consultant, and the city, how can we help you get there? Because there are cost implications, there are design implications. And that's something that, we're always interested to discuss, is how we can help do that.
All right, so Kara, I think David's teeing you up regarding design and such. So what do these requirements, these green standards, mean for building design? Maybe you can kind of give us some examples.
Yeah, I mean, we've been really seeing a decline in all glass buildings since the TGS was implemented, which has been, I think, really good for the occupants of the buildings. There's less glare, less overheating in summer. And as a mechanical engineer, it's a lot easier for me to provide heating and cooling that's effective. As a practitioner, it's been difficult to find the equipment we need to hit these performance targets. So we're really looking to manufacturers to bring the bottom up on the performance of their building components, particularly energy recovery ventilation systems, which contribute to some of the key targets. And then as everyone's mentioned, getting to electrified building heating and cooling solutions. So geothermal is a really helpful technology because it has really good performance on the coldest days of the year. So it contributes really effectively to supporting our grid by using less electricity at peak than some of the other heat pump technologies available.
Okay, so you talked a little bit, but what does this really mean for your practice? And these are things that you probably have to adjust for. And how's your practice sort of evolved with these standards?
That's a good question. So we are spending more time earlier with clients examining what the opportunities are for their buildings, and having to learn a lot more about the technologies that are available. So we spent, I would say, 30% more time learning about the new technologies, being able to explain what heat pumps are available on the market, whether or not different heating technologies are appropriate for building solutions, and looping in people who can provide potentially financing for some of these high cost first options, so that we can hit the targets without impeding the developer's goals.
Okay, Matt, we're going to talk about Subterra's business model because obviously it's relevant to all these things going on. Can you give us the background on that?
Sure. So Subterra, just to give the one sentence overview, is a geothermal solutions provider. That means we are a driller, installer, but also sort of overall development and construction manager for geothermal projects. And what's really interesting and innovative and I think exciting to talk about here today is what we call our energy as a service model, where we co-invest with the project team to install these systems. And so what you'll find about a geothermal system as part of the formula for getting to net zero is that they tend to be capitally intensive. They're more expensive oftentimes than the conventional fossil fuel burning system initially, but over the life cycle through the operation, they're cheaper. So there's often a misalignment in, for example, the condo market where condo developers are largely focused on first costs and trying to deliver a project that's sufficient and comfortable and that people want to live in, but that's also economical since their goal is to sell the units and exit the project. For us, we're happy to stay involved in the project for the long term, and we take a long view on the investment. And like I said, when you can take that long-term view, there's a very attractive operational savings from these systems. So the energy as a service model puts us as a co-investor in the project. We install the system, we design it, we ultimately retain the ownership of the system and sell back thermal energy to the building, make sure that everything's operating well, and in doing so, eliminate that initial hurdle, which is that cost of capital, or excuse me, that capital expenditure at the start of the project.
Okay, I think this is an important point. And so independent of the technology around geothermal that you might be using with developers, this financial barrier is such an important point, right? I mean, what you've created is you're not going to get, I guess, to the next level unless you've given them some options to overcome that financial barrier.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, there are a lot of folks that understand the technology. They understand the tailwinds behind us from the social implications and from what we're trying to do on a global perspective. And they say, look, I really want to implement this, but hey, if it's going to cost me, X dollars more, I've got an investment committee to sell this to, and unfortunately, this is going to land on the cutting room floor.
All right, and David, I want to bring you into this. And so, are there financial incentives, I guess, at the city level or even a national level associated with what you're net zero and trying to use geothermal that private companies can use?
Yeah, definitely. So at the local level, there are incentives that some we've offered for quite a while, and some are new and emerging. Um, when it comes to, so we don't have incentives specifically for geothermal, but through the Toronto Green Standard, we have sort of a performance-based incentive that if you achieve one of the higher tiers, so tier 2 or tier 3, you are eligible for a partial refund on development charges. And that's always been how we've attracted sort of that voluntary higher level performance, or how we've incentivized it. Development charges, that's something that obviously developers are very familiar with. And so they understand, and it's very predictable in terms of what they'll receive if they achieve a performance level. The thing about geothermal is, for large buildings in Toronto, it makes a lot of sense in terms of how they can meet both the carbon and the energy targets. So we find a lot of developers, real estate developers, are pursuing that because it's tried and true. And now with this business model from energy developers like Subterra, it really helps to avoid that upfront cost where a lot of condominium developers would normally not be interested, but because they're not sort of concerned about payback, it's now something that they can participate in and get the full advantage of if they're not sort of interested in investing it themselves. And so I'll say that we're probably tracking 20 to 30 geothermal projects actively right now in Toronto, and the vast majority of those are being delivered by energy developers. And I think that's a testament to the success of that business model. And on incentives specifically in terms of new ones, we're trying to attract that in particular by allowing developers to take advantage of the mechanical penthouse space that gets freed up when you use something like geothermal. And so we're trying to convert that real estate space savings into an incentive and essentially make the pitch that to the real estate developer, go partner with an energy developer, get the energy performance benefit, get the green standard development charge refund, and take advantage of that freed up mechanical space. So all of those things combined, I think, is helping to transform the market and accelerate low carbon heating and cooling solutions.
I love hearing about creative incentive programs. It seems like there's not enough of those. But Kara, I want to go back to you. And so what kind of systems do we have to implement, and what is the best way to meet the version 4 of those Toronto Green Standards?
So there are a very few silver bullets that will get us huge jumps in energy efficiency to be able to hit these targets. One of the only ones is geothermal and heat pumps. Other than that, there are dozens of small changes that are required from status quo construction to be able to slowly dial down the heat loss from the building, addressing thermal bridges, looking at air tightness, adding efficiency on the domestic potable water systems, doing as much energy recovery as possible in as many different locations in the building as possible. I'm a bit of an evangelist for drain water heat recovery in multi-unit residential buildings. I think it's a really underused opportunity. But I think we also are going to need to spend more time thinking about the anticipated increased load on the electrical grid and how we're going to reduce exposure for our clients to potential rising electricity costs as everyone jumps on to heating their buildings in addition to cooling them with electricity.
All right, Matt, I want to jump back to you. And David just mentioned some of those incentives, and I think it'd be really helpful is, with Subterra, how are these incentives and the various programs that they have helpful to you?
Well, for us, we get to sort of leverage the Toronto Green Standard as part of our sales pitch, really, right? We get to say, the formula is simple. In my opinion, the formula to get to net zero is simple, but inverted to sort of common sense, right? Everybody thinks we need to just start going and plastering our buildings with solar panels, which is sort of the last thing that you want to do. I think Kara just touched on this, but if we simplify it down to its most basic forms, it's step one, reduce the loads as much as you can, which means address the envelope. Number two is find the right mechanical system that's efficient and that's ideally fuel switched, i.e. heat pumps. And then step three is start adding on the generation on top. So it's sort of an inverted triangle of what everybody thinks about. And that gets very much reflected by the way that the Toronto Green Standard is built. There are targets specifically for the thermal demand of the envelope. So how good is your envelope? There's a measure for the total energy use, and then there's a measure for the greenhouse gas intensity. And so for us, we talk to clients and say, hey, you need to hit this Toronto Green Standard to get your site plan approved, or if you want to leverage these incentives, here's the sort of next host of packages and designs that you can look at to get you to that level. And because of that, and because of that incentive that's being offered by the city, we get to say, hey, we're part of that package. Let's work together to find the solution to get to those higher levels together.
All right, Kara. So it seems like this can get complicated really easily, and you have to have the right people during this whole process. And so, how does the design process here change?
So, I mean, the number one thing is that it's important to bring on your design team earlier in the process. Having energy simulators at the table, ideally mechanical and electrical engineers, and in a perfect world, even a building scientist or a building envelope consultant, so that you can look at these trade-offs early. One of the things we haven't said about geothermal yet is that it's sized based on the peak heat loss. So Toronto Green Standard is driving the peak heat loss down, but being able to drive that heat load down also reduces the first capital cost of the geothermal system. So if you can look at trade-offs between windows, better glazing, those sort of usually high cost components that had really long paybacks when we were buying cheap and cheerful boilers, early enough to be able to establish a business case, then when we work through the design process, we don't end up losing those things to value engineering. The City of Toronto in 2017, when they rolled out this next generation Toronto Green Standard, wrote a report that showed that the version 4, or the sort of highest tier performing buildings, actually cost less than the second to next best buildings, because they took advantage of these interactions between the really high performance building envelope and the lower cost mechanical and electrical systems. So, number one thing is getting people in early and identifying those paybacks and spaces that you can get back. So identifying the value of the penthouse or the saved mechanical equipment space so that it can be rolled into the pro forma, and you can get people not just meeting the standard, but also really seeing the benefit.
And David, question for you is, you work with the private sector on this, and you guys within the City of Toronto have set these standards. It must be, I guess, enlightening to see how the private sector is putting their minds to this, right? And you get to work with people like Matt and Kara and just saying, all right, here's some standards, but seeing how it evolves out there. It must be, I guess, a bit fascinating for you too.
Look, it absolutely is. Of course, at the city, we focus a lot on our portfolio of buildings, but by any measure, that's a fraction of what the industry builds on an annual basis. And so, by extension, the emissions are really coming from buildings that are outside of the city's direct control. So we have to find creative ways to influence that. And so the Green Standard does that, and we've thankfully been able to ratchet up the performance over many years. So now we're seeing that transition that we've always envisioned. But the city as well has to lead by example, and so we set ourselves to a higher bar. For in fact, very recently, city council decided we need to be net zero now, and so we are putting our money where our mouth is, and we can definitely do better. But I mean, fundamentally, this is part of our role, is to lead by example. We are doing our own geothermal projects, our own low carbon heating and cooling projects. So that's all happening. And I think the other thing that's important, you asked about federal incentives earlier. There's a lot of change happening right now at the federal government. Things are emerging in terms of new plans, new funding sources. I think it's important that we all collectively advocate for support at all levels of government. There's no one that can do it on its own. And at the federal level, the carbon tax is making a huge difference in the business case for these kinds of projects. And that, I think, has been really critical, and it needs to stay in place so that fundamentally there's a stability in the marketplace for companies like Subterra to be able to invest, and for others to be able to invest as well. I think that's so important for the private sector to activate them, is this policy and pricing stability. So that's another thing that we collectively do, is to advocate to other levels of government for that stability.
I'll maybe just add to that point there, Doug,
Yes.
just to highlight, I'm not sure we spoke much about it, but the carbon tax is also playing an important role in this dynamic. When we talk about this fuel switching, just to put a point on that, we're effectively moving from a natural gas, a fossil fuel burning system to an electrically driven heat pump system, which is how these systems operate. And so by switching from the fossil fuel burning to the electrically driven, we're really future-proofing our buildings, and that's really important to point on. The carbon tax right now is, I can't remember the exact number, $50 or $70 a ton, $50 I think right now, and over the next number of years to 2030, it's going to get up to 170. And effectively, what that's going to do is almost double the effective price of natural gas. So by making that fuel switch to electricity now, you're really future-proofing your building operation over the next decades.
Fantastic. All right, guys, we're here at the end of our interview, but I just kind of want to go around. I'm going to start with you, Kara. Just what's next? Obviously, in the context of what we're doing here, but what's next for you?
I mean, we're still working on a bunch of net zero projects. So I'm very excited about some net zero multi-unit residential buildings we're working on that are using passive house as a lens to hit those really high energy performance targets. Many of them have geothermal in their designs. We're also working on our first 1 million square foot certified building that's net zero. So that's going to be really exciting.
Fantastic. And David, what about you?
There's a lot happening right now. Something we didn't touch on too much today is the notion of embodied carbon. So the carbon associated with materials. That's sort of the next emerging frontier. And so on that note, we at the city are working right now on some mass timber projects, but it's not. It's both the embodied and the operational. So these happen to be mass timber projects that are going to use geothermal systems. And so we're finding a really nice combination at this sort of mid-rise building scale, mass timber, geothermal, passive design. It's like the holy grail for us as a city and what we're trying to build. So really looking forward to being able to share more about that in the coming months.
And Matt, I want you to tell us what's next for you, but also if people want to learn more about what's going on here, and especially with Subterra, maybe give them some options for looking things up.
Sure. Yeah. So you can find us at subterrarenewables.com. We've got emails up on the website there. If you want to reach out to us directly, feel free to do so. If you want to talk about projects or ideas or whatever sort of stuff you're thinking about, we're always excited to talk and meet new people and learn new things. In terms of Subterra's growth, we are looking to expand rapidly across both Canada and eventually south of the border. Like we said before, the formula to get to net zero is not a secret. We know how to do it. We've got the technology now. There's no reason we shouldn't be doing this on every building that we touch, and that's our objective.
All right, guys, I'm going to bring you to just chatting, but I just want to say thanks for joining the show, Kara, David, and Matt. It's been a pleasure. Fascinating what you're doing. It's very ambitious, and good luck with what you're doing.
Thanks so much, Doug. Appreciate your time.